so much for making time to be here. We're really excited to have you and for being at UWC. And I want to thank all of you for being here, as well as all of those who are joining us virtually. Thank you for joining us. I'm not going to introduce you because Umesh is going to be the ones. I want to call Umesh, who's first going to read the poem and then introduce you. Okay? So thank you for being here, and we're excited to have you all here. Umesh, you join us.
Thank you very much, colleagues. It's really lovely that you are here, and you know that we're going to take your passport away, so you stay here forever. We're really good about doing that. So, colleagues, both to you and to Razak from the ISD, Institute for Social Development, our colleagues here from ISHS. We have some colleagues who are here from Cuba, Professor Barranco, Professor Reyes, and Professor Rubio. Welcome. We have a nice partnership with the University of Santa Clara, and so it's really lovely that you're here. Roberto, you may have to do some translation with your colleagues on some of this. It's really fantastic to be able to host this event here, together with our colleagues from UNISA, and Mohammed Sirat and Alicia are here. You want to stand up, Alicia? No, okay. And just to welcome us, we are going to have a very, the process will be threefold. One is we'll just have our colleagues to talk, share some of their thoughts for 10 to 15 minutes each. And then Primesh Lalu from the Center for Humanities Research, the leading center at the university, will be facilitating the conversations. We would like to encourage our colleagues who are online to send their questions that they have through the WhatsApp, and Dr. Nick Malherbe will then be facilitating those questions forward to us. I'm going to start with a poem to be able to try and ground two things. This university has a very good reputation of being committed to activism, being committed to the excellence, to social justice, and that is something that is really, in this very divided world, something that's really, really quite important to have, to keep a focus on. And so I want to read a poem from, you late, Mr. Mshumi? Shapne? Okay. I want to read a poem by an Angolan poet, Costa Andrade, and the poet is an essay on color. And the framing of this poem is about the schism between scholarship and intellectual activity and the community. So this is a poem. It's called Essay on Color, and it's for Paulo Jorge. Those who discuss the dimensions of bright red and write treatises on the function of color never saw the red of a wound opened by the burst of a grenade. Neither tears, nor despairs, nor impotent hatreds are the shroud that covers the red of a wound opened by a burst of a grenade. Those who have never seen a wound opened by the burst of a grenade cannot understand how much love of life, of color, and of the flowers of one's native land lies in the decision of the guerrilla fighter. They cannot totally understand the color red. The grenade that steals the companion from space, fixes the image, causes to burst out in men the certainty of singing in triumph, unfurling gleaming acacia's liberty. The dimension of bright red of a companion's death is another flower, sublime season of love and arms, clouds of a setting sun. Costa Andrade. And so to our colleagues here, welcome again. Our session is the conversations of being a guerrilla scholar. and it's with Lara Sheehi and Stephen Sheehi. Welcome. Lara Sheehi is a psychologist, and as you know, all of the psychologists are going to rule the world, as we do. So, and Lara teaches decolonial liberatory and anti-oppressive theories and approaches to clinical treatment, case conceptualization, and community consultation at the George Washington University Professional Psychology Program. She's a founding director of the Psychoanalysis in the Arab World Lab. She's president-elect of the Society for Psychoanalysis and Psychoanalytic Psychology of the APA Division 39. And like Shanaz Safla, who is here, who has just been the president of the Psychological Society of South Africa, they're both quite remarkable. Lara is also the chair of the Teachers Academy of the American Psychoanalytic Association. She's co-editor of Studies in Gender and Sexuality, co-editor of Counter Space in Psychoanalysis, Culture and Society, and on the editorial board for the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association. Lara is on the advisory board to the USA-Palestine Mental Health Network and Psychoanalysis for Pride. Psychoanalysis in South Africa and globally has been really very conservative and had a look, promotes a look to the interior rather than addressing the issues within society. Lara is going to be talking about some of that. Stephen Sheehi is currently the Sultan Qaboos Professor of Middle East Studies in the Asian and Middle East Studies Program, Arab Studies Program, and Asian and Pacific Islander American Studies Program at William and Mary, where he's also the founding director of the Decolonising Humanities Project. Professor Sheehi is an author of a number of books, articles, book chapters, commentaries. Most recently, his co-authored book with Lara Sheehi, Psychoanalysts Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, and Camera Palestina, Photography and the Displaced Histories of Palestine, co-authored with Esther Mari and I. Nasser, both from the University of California Press. He is on the editorial board of the Trans-Asian Photography Regards, Revue des Arts du Spectacle, and Routledge's Decolonizing the Classics series, and on the advisory boards of the USA-Palestine Mental Health Network and Milestones Commentary on the Islamic World. You guys do so much work. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome both of you, and I think Shanaz, I'm going to hand over. Okay.
This is a celebratory moment for all of us that we'd like to share with you. So may I add? Sorry, Chair, through you, of course. Lara and Stephen recently won the Middle East Monitor's Palestine Book Award. Yes, yes. For their book, Psychoanalysis Under Occupation. Nick, I think you have a slide. Yes. While Nick is doing that for us, and this happened very recently at the annual literary awards ceremony in London last week, Friday. Yes. Congratulations from your South African comrades and friends. And if I may, Chair, I would like to read a brief description of the book. Thank you. And this, of course, is as your book has been described, heavily influenced by Frantz Fanon and critically engaging the theories of decoloniality and liberatory psychoanalysis, Lara and Stephen platformed the lives, perspectives, and insights of psychoanalytically inflected Palestinian psychologists, psychiatrists, and other mental health professionals, centering the stories that non-clinical Palestinians have entrusted to them over 4 years of community engagement with clinicians throughout historic Palestine. The book unpacks the intersection of psychoanalysis as a psychological practice in Palestine, while also advancing a set of therapeutic theories in which to critically engage and read the politically complex array of conditions that define life for Palestinians living under Israeli occupation. It just would seem to be, it would be such an omission to introduce you without saying something about your book. So warm welcome and over to you. Thanks.
Commando activity is an expression too of the determination of the Palestinian people to take the initiative in blazing the trail for total liberation, which is also the responsibility of the whole Arab people. And as I said, that's the first political statement of the PFLP. So over the past, good. Right. So I'm not going to read that over again, though, but because of time. But I will say that I've been dwelling in these works of ancestors, including Samir Amin and the Palestinian resistance tradition. So how I've been thinking, do we convert that energy of commando activity, which the tech seems to take out of the room constantly, but will not? That expression of our people's refusal to submit to imperialism, settler colonialism, racial capitalist exploitation, and cis heteronormative patriarchy in the form of our lives as scholars, as radical intellectuals rooted in the neoliberal university. Indeed, how do we engage in militant action and organizing in any capacity, let alone in universities, in a globalized world bound by hyper-state surveillance? In armed commando activity. A guerrilla scholar may be rooted in the university, but they are not someone who peddles the knowledge in the marketplace of ideas, as our universities and their advertising agents tell us. Radical scholars are not neoliberal brokers specializing in knowledge acquisitions, and therefore knowledge as a commodity. Nor should we be reformist first responders attending to the violence of racial capitalism, imperialism, settler colonialism, and cis heteronormativity, creating a more empathetic, more understanding, a less racist, a less sexist citizen to ameliorate the contradictions of racial capitalism. A guerrilla scholar should be, as Sarah Ahmed says, a feminist killjoy, a worker as Cabral says, a worker for revolutionary consciousness of people as a weapon of defense. We work to destabilize our position as petite bourgeois intellectuals, as reproducers of the empire's managerial class, rather than innovate a happier, safer, and more inclusive consensual racial capitalism, settler colonialism, and patriarchy. We agitate these contradictions to make them untenably visible. When we use the phrase guerrilla scholar, we do so with profound respect and gravity. It is not flippant or performative. It is, on the one hand, a tribute to guerrillas, militants, and revolutionary commandos throughout the ages in the global South who have fought for liberation against the tyranny of racial capitalism and colonialism. And for that reason, Umesh, I thank you for your poem. It was wonderful. That tradition carries South Africa. The militancy of Oliver Tambo cannot be contained in an airport. As Arabs, we pay deference and honor our ancestors and our martyrs, but also our living elders like Leila Khalid and the imprisoned George Abdullah. In paying this honor, we have no pretense to the perils that guerrillas faced and face, as we witness today with the valiant resistance of the Fidayeen in Palestine, especially the Lions in Nablus. To be a guerrilla scholar starts, therefore, at honoring and learning from our ancestors, from our elders, and from our political and intellectual siblings. And I count Muhammad and Shahnaz and Umesh and Primesh, who I'll be reading soon, as among those siblings. We learn from them and their camaraderie, generosity, and revolutionary love, from their intellect, their analysis, and their commitment, and not getting bogged down in sectarian trifling or imperfections. The reason why Lara and I have chosen guerrilla scholar and not guerrilla is because we understand that we are limited and indeed fed by this, but yet still exploit and exhaust the limits of the university. Bell Hooks teaches us that, quote, an insurgent intellectual works in a continual counter-hegemonic campaign of transforming consciousness. She considers the classroom and the campus as a space of insurgency. Roads must fall and fees must fall have shown us this. Yet, moreover, in speaking directly to Black women, Bell Hooks assures us, quote, that those of us who fear, quote, who fear that the intellectual work on campus estranges us from the real world, quote, that when we do insurgent intellectual work that speaks to a diverse audience, carrying it between diverse classes, ethnicities, and backgrounds, educational backgrounds, commuting between campus and community, we become a part of communities of resistance, unquote. Like the insurgent intellectual, the guerrilla scholar nests themselves in what Harvey and Moten call the fugitive spaces within the same university that seeks to contain domestic but it is actually this and lives of fidei, ancestors, elders, and siblings in order to actualize their power of embodied commitment to revolutionary principles. To join others in normalizing, expanding, and reinforcing the counter-hegemony of fugitive and insurgent communities and the lives on and off campuses. It is to fight to live in what Black quantum futurisms, the collective calls the everywhens. It is to dwell in the being of the world and what I'm calling the decolonial now of our communities of resistance. Apart from the notion of guerrilla scholars who move between many spaces, communities, between community and university perhaps, we advocate strategical movement between academic and political discourses while being loyal to none of them. While riveted to our political commitments and yes, revolutionary theory, a guerrilla scholar should feel free to utilize disciplinary methodologies, the current academic discourses, intellectual tools, funding, and infrastructure to and exploit the contradictions within the bad faith efforts of universities, including Pollyannish, decolonizing, and diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, which Lara will be talking about, in order to work towards a counter-hegemonic and yes, revolutionary ends. It is Amilcar Cabral who reminds us that revolutionary action and building knowledge of our material conditions relies on our ability to, quote, to identify the contradictions within capitalism and ourselves to form a theory of revolutionary praxis. The guerrilla scholar for us is not exclusivizing about producing knowledge. The idea of production is always locked in a circle of labor as exchange value. We seek to weaponize knowledge generated and given life from the ground up, knowledge generated by in order to create a world that we habitate equitably. So let us back up. How then to convert this energy of commando activity, which is an expression of our people's refusal to submit or surrender, into our roles as guerrilla scholars? How to think and act as a militants who interpret the world from a position not only of being in the world, as Heidegger says, but being of the world. As the PFLP manifesto guides us, our history needs to be written. Every people to have their own history. So part of owning our own collective and shared history or neoliberal capitalism. This includes the imperative to make Palestine, settler colonialism, and empire visible. It necessitates a refusal to collaborate, and to collaborate with what Lara and I call the reality bending of imperialism and racial capitalism. Guerrilla scholars are central to confronting the reality bending that seeks to deny the existence of Palestine, the rights of the Palestinian people to their history, to their land, and to their dignity. But also we work against the enforcement of disciplinary measures over those who do not comply. And I'm speaking of the way the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is being foisted on universities throughout the world, and in particular in Europe and North America. Fred Moten states that to act on the desire not to collaborate is to object. It is to refuse, unquote. To refuse and to object is an act of affirmation. Guerrilla scholarship is structured by affirmation, the affirmation of oppressed selfhoods, not methodologies, discourses, or theories that should be adopted and discarded with tactical precision. To act, the act of desire, to object, to refuse, to not collaborate is an ontological from Jacksonville to Johannesburg to Jerusalem.
Sorry, we're just going to pause. We're having a bit of a challenge with the internet, and our participants online are struggling to follow the conversation.
We'll wait for a few minutes. Okay. All yours.
Thank you so much, everybody. And you see why I love him and why our work and our struggle is also called by radical love. And I think I'm so happy to be here with you all today. This is our first joint talk in person. So it feels very fitting, like after the pandemic. Feels very fitting for it to be here among our friends, our comrades. And he thanked everybody, so I won't belabor that, but I do also, for both of us, want to thank the labor. Oftentimes that's invisible to make these things happen. I know Shahnaz has spent many hours making sure everything's okay, but to all of you who I might not know your name, thank you so much, because these things don't happen without that. It feels very fitting that we're doing this talk today on the day that the settler colony and heart of empire of the state, now known as the United States, is going through its midterm elections. And on the day that the fascist Donald Trump is meant to announce his intention to run again. It feels fitting because they will win, at least electorally. The global shift to fascism shows us a particular type of ideological win that we need to take seriously. And I should say a shift back. Within this framework, as Stephen spoke about, we can no longer deny that our commitment to a revolutionary politics is not only necessary for psychic and sometimes literal physical survival, but also how it acts as a fundamental life force for the networks of solidarity that defy borders. Stephen spoke of the why and what of guerrilla scholarship, and I'll try to speak a bit about the how. Part of the how is already being enacted in embodied space here today. This is an in vivo example of that. More specifically, how guerrilla scholarship is born out of decolonial community building, knowledge production, non-extractive modes of relationality, sharing of resources versus colonial hoarding, and political commitment to revolutionary futures and possibilities of being even under the crush of fascism. I speak to you about my own commitments to guerrilla scholarship from a positionality of being both a psychologist and an academic. And yes, Umesh, I think psychologists rule the world, but sometimes for evil, and that's what we're going to try and stop. So my positionality here is both academic as a professor, clinically, I have a private practice, and then of course in professional spaces, in leadership positions, or just in organizing in professional spaces. My guiding questions to asymmetrical warfare in a neoliberal environment have been, one, what does it mean to disrupt the going on being of normativity without reinscribing it? And here I'm specifically thinking, and we'll talk a little bit more about the ever-growing diversity industry, particularly in North America, the diversity efforts, for example, that currently do very little other than stabilize coloniality under the guise of progressivism within universities. And when I talk about this, I borrow, of course, from revolutionary Angela Davis, who said, I love this quote, I have a hard time accepting diversity as a synonym for justice. Diversity is a corporate strategy. It's a strategy designed to ensure that the institution functions in the same way that it functioned before, except now you have some black faces and brown faces. It's a difference that doesn't make a difference, end quote. My second question, how do we commit to what I might understand as abolitionist practices of relating? And abolitionist, of course, meaning abolish all prisons, but also abolitionists as in disrupting all forms of coercion and domination, while functioning still within systems that themselves are sustained by those practices, the university being one such place, psychology an entire field based on disciplining bodies and psyches. So here I'm wondering, how do we not allow our desire to object, as Stephen talked about, to be squashed? How do we not succumb to the pressures put upon us to not speak Palestine, to not attend to the glaring brutality of settler colonialism, to not collaborate, to not bend reality in service of settler colonial reality? How do we commit to persistently disrupting disavowals? Finally, along those lines, and this is my third question, how do we take seriously a radical redistribution of responsibility for these processes? What Gail Lewis, a Black feminist psychotherapist in the UK, calls walking alongside rather than in front of our students to move them to revolutionary possibilities with us versus stamping out their fire or ourselves becoming what Frantz Fanon called confusion mongers. He has a very special place in Wretched of the Earth for psychologists and academics, calling us confusion mongers. So those are my overarching questions, and I'd like to move into some examples of ways I have done this, or at least tried to do this, but I'm much more excited to hear about from all of you about ways you have done it as well, and to be in conversation about that. So number one, disrupting normativity, the classroom and consulting place. I'm often asked to do workshops on diversity and or consult with people or places about their diversity efforts. And I put it in scare quotes because diversity delineates one thing, whiteness, right? Every time we have diversity, it's because somebody other than a white person exists in the room. So that's why I always have it in scare quotes. And of course, I'm often asked that because of who I am and the work that I do. And my answer usually, and I'll get into it a little bit more, less tongue in cheek, is I tell them not to do them. And here's why. The problem of choosing representational diversity, because that's what those diversity efforts are about, as Angela Davis had said, it's a corporate strategy of representational diversity only over sustained structural change, especially within psychoanalytic spaces, is itself a social production and reproduction. And it's not an innocent one, though it might feel very important for psychoanalysis in the field to insist that this is innocent and also very good. The problem instead is that psychoanalysis and psychology, by and large, has a history of relying on empty diversity efforts rather than structural change, because itself as a field remains inextricably linked to soft power and sometimes hard power, as in the cases in the United States at the southern border, having psychologists test asylum seekers and having their notes being taken by the government to prove that that asylum seekers should not gain entry into the United States. The other way is that the institutional and cultural currency of psychology and psychoanalysis, the necessity of retaining and perpetuating that power, renders any attempt at a viable inclusion movement empty or at best hypocritical. Perhaps this is why we see the same logics of exclusion repeated over history, the same texture, different words, different bodies, sometimes different subjectivities, but it's the same logic. They are not enough as efforts, and that's why I tell people tongue-in-cheek, don't do them. They're not enough because they peddle a false narrative of inclusivity that, rather than shift the structural bedrock, fundamentally stabilizes psychoanalysis as is, structures as is, psychology as is, and the world as is. And they do so because they're invested in a particular social order that is underscored by ideology. This ideological position is the one that can readily imagine, as it can disimagine, certain people in diverse spaces, a diverse space that becomes another type of normativity, a diverse space without politics. And so here we have at least one part of our answer. Guerrilla scholarship is explicitly political. I am explicitly political. So when I'm called upon to consult about diversity efforts, this is yet another avenue for political intervention, to destabilize coloniality by putting pressure on the white supremacist ideological tenets of the space itself, that conditions, that create the lack of diversity, rather than support the manic repair, this sort of like rush to fix everything without doing really anything, because the infrastructure itself continues to be inhospitable to life. In this way, a guerrilla scholar makes diversity and diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts a field of contention itself, rather than just becoming what Sarah Ahmed calls only an institutional plumber, unstucking things without fixing the infrastructure. Number 2, disrupting disavowals. This is about professional spaces. The mere mention of Palestine can instigate an ideological psychic break. Approximately halfway through a panel I was giving with colleagues called Talking About Palestine in Psychoanalysis. That title is hardly revolutionary, Talking About Palestine in Psychoanalysis. A middle-aged white man wearing a white shirt adorned with the Israeli flag made his flagrant entrance into our room. He carried a large paper bag and exuded aggressive energy by locking eyes with me, the only woman and the only Arab on the panel, and repeatedly flexed his biceps and cracked his knuckles as if preparing for a fight. This was in the United States. So the United States is also, even though it figures itself as the head of everything, is also the head of mass shootings. So when I saw that bag, there was an added level of worry about somebody coming in with a gun. The irony was not lost on me that he also appeared to warrior up by wrapping his neck with a kufi. His version, however, was adorned with Israeli flags. This man, a psychoanalyst living in New York, blocked the doorway and only entrance to the room for the entire duration of the panel. That's 2 hours. He disrupted the panel continually, admonishing the panelists and audience with declarations such as there's no such thing as Palestinians and Palestine has no place in psychoanalysis. When people exited at the conclusion of the panel, he forced pamphlets onto them that were entitled, quote, 101 lies that Palestinians tell. The experience was a first for many people in the audience, not mine. But attempts to intervene from senior clinicians, leftist clinicians, largely relied on traditional psychoanalytic theory to offer readings of what may have been happening in the group process. It's an enactment, it's a, identification with the aggressor, all these sorts of things. What was largely missing from the interventions, and really absurd when you're seeing it, unfold in real time, and what guerrilla scholarship as a methodology, intervention, and analytic helps us understand, was what was missing was an acknowledgement of what was unfolding materially, or an analysis regarding the ways in which normative ideology was being actively weaponized. I understood what this man thought was his imperative, not only to silence dissenting voices, but also to purposefully deflect and derail a reality testing exercise that brought Palestine to the forefront against the crushing weight of a dominantly entrenched Zionist ideology. That's disrupting the disavowal. My investment in guerrilla scholarship provided me space to think and an act in alignment. I literally wrote to myself, don't let him decolonize your mind. Don't let him colonize your mind. Don't let him colonize, because that was the effect of his presence. I noted to everybody in the room, if we're to call what's happening an enactment, it's one that is structurally constitutive of Zionism. This is an act right out of the book of Zionism. This act was not arbitrary, nor was it individual or individualized, but rather a logical extension of the violence of the settler colonial state of Israel, a state that necessitates settler colonial outposts everywhere. Here, in my case, at a conference to sustain its myth. Further, in the context of psychoanalysis, this was a vigilante attempt to name what constitutes appropriate or pure psychoanalytic content, a practice that itself is perpetuated by white supremacist ideology. None of this will be strange to all of you in South Africa. The enactment exposed a real-time disruption of settler colonial reality bending. That's what we talk about in our book. So in this way, merely talking about Palestine, speaking Palestine, enacting Palestine, refusing to collaborate, disrupts disavowals. My final example is called walking alongside the clinic. I'm often asked by my student what it means to be anti-imperialist, decolonial, and anti-capitalist in practice. What does one actually do to be those things, especially in the heart of empire in the United States? Being committed to guerrilla scholarship means despecializing knowledge and working alongside students as they, according to how one of my students said it, and it's brilliantly stated, she said, as I realized that some fires sear and wound while others sustain life, end quote. So what does it mean to be explicit as a professor, as a guerrilla scholar, in harnessing the fire that sustains life? I tell them I'm anti-capitalist, which means it is our responsibility to make known the links between psychic suffering and systemic exploitation and class warfare. This doesn't mean we don't make a living wage. This is what they're told in the United States. That means you will never get a job, you won't be able to feed yourself. To the contrary, it means that we're committed to a practice that is not at the expense of others' sustained livability. More importantly, it means that we commit ourselves to speaking to the violence done in the name of capitalist enterprises, that these are responsible for psychic suffering and for the destruction of the environment. It also means we commit to interrogating the ways in which our field, psychology as a whole, psychoanalysis as a subset, and our practice sustains class inequities and lack of access by design. It's not a byproduct that somehow happened. It was by design that access was constricted. And then what does it mean to be an anti-imperialist? It means to disrupt at every move the US-centric models of functioning in the world, normative functions, and instead support expansiveness, right? And disrupt the belief that borders are natural. In this way, I call upon clinicians and I talk to my students about our responsibility, our ethical imperative to realize that our egos can also not be imperialist or imperious either. As clinicians, we are not entitled to people's interiority. Just because they come into our room, the expansiveness of the border, an imperial border, does not extend into somebody else's interiority as a colonial practice. It also means that when we practice, especially in the United States, we have to understand the socio-political position of the United States as an imperial and colonial power in the world, including the violence it has inflicted on others, especially in the global South. This is not a thing of the past, this is ongoing. We also work toward global networks, toward equitable representation of folks from the global South as reparations for this. This is not just a representational politics, it's a political commitment to reparations for the harm and violence done by empires like the United States. And this is where I will end. Finally, as decolonial scholars, we are committed to what Sarah Ahmed says, quote, the fundamentally life-affirming task to build institutions or spaces that are not dependent on the diminishment of the life capacities of others, end quote. Thank you so much.
Lara and Stephen, thank you very much. That was really beautifully and eloquently put to us. I'm going to get us started with a few comments, and I'm really, equally shocked by, as I think everybody else is here, by the experience of the US Academy and, the kind of disastrous affront that you described in that moment on the panel. But I want to ask us to think a little bit with Edward Said here. And I think we are in a space of humanism and democratic criticism. In fact, I think what you're citing as Sarah Ahmed's kind of reckoning with the idea of institutional spaces where we can think through these questions. I think, UWC, as I was trying to indicate in the walkabout we did of the Maibuye archives, has had its fair share of sectarian disagreements and, sometimes violently so in the 1980s, but, held up a proposition of thinking about this space as a space to think through predicaments and difficulties. So I want to point to just 3 issues that, just to get us started off. And the one is 1948. In some sense, I'm wondering about what one does with the word partition, because it does seem to me that there's a gloss in the way in which Minola and others have proposed decoloniality. And, there's a debate in South Africa in the 70s. Some Marxists had written in relation to Keano in the Review of African Political Economy to argue that the crisis of the homelands was not translatable as a problem of development of underdevelopment. And so there's a debate, about the translations of this term across spaces. So I want to put to you it's a question. What do we do with this word partition? And how do we, think through this shared 1948 term? It's a post-Second World War term. It's a new political technology. And it's interesting that Verwoerd, in his opening of Parliament in 1948, this is the so-called architect of apartheid, who is really just a lab technician in a minor discipline of experimental psychology. What he proposes in that moment is a reckoning of what will happen in the Middle East. So he speaks about Russia in that speech. He talks and he's anticipating Ukraine, and he's talking about partition. And on this continent, we've had to think about this problem very, very seriously. Eritrea, Ethiopia, Sudan, now we have split states all across this continent. So help us to think a little bit about this word partition. The second is this, that I want to just call attention to, is the way in which, across the two presentations, we have on the one hand, a shift from global capitalism and imperialism to the shift to the rise of fascism, contemporary forms of fascism. And yet, when I'm not a big Heideggerian reader of Heidegger, but when you mention Heidegger, I thought immediately of, as everyone does, the question of technology. It does seem to me that something has shifted in the discourse of race with new technological resources, with expansion in technological resources. Ought we to think this as a problem of addressing the kind of world that we inhabit now? Because it does seem to me that we appear to be in a circular causality. And what we're facing in this country is a generational conflict that just does not want to stop. And we dealt with this in the 1980s, a tension between liberation and education, because there are competing temporalities. Liberation has an immediacy attached to it. Education is duration. And it led to endless fights in the 1980s, huge battles with families. So you mentioned fees must fall, but many parents called me when the student movement unfolded here and said, we had given up our education in 1985, and you asked us to do that. And now our grandchildren are also giving up their education. We ended up in the factory. So the question of how to interrupt circular causality, to stop a slide into perpetual civil war, which is always our lot, is something I'm asking you to help us think through. And then finally, if I may, there's something about stasis, that you pointing to, Lara, that is just a deeply worrying condition now, that every sense we have of movement in our world, of migration, of, the catastrophes of climate devastation is producing an absolute anxiety, an anxious condition, a psychic condition that is causing great despair. And it's producing the sense of, that we've actually reached the point of stasis. I want to ask you to think with us about what it means to set us in motion, to get us to the other shore, as Seamus Heaney would have said in that famous poem that was written for Mandela. So just, some opening comments. I'm sure there are many more. At some point I thought I'm the humanist amongst psychologists, and those are where my thoughts go. But let's hear from others in the audience. Shall we open up for a round of comments, questions? I know there are possible comments that are coming on, via the online group. So any takers? There's one online. Is there one online? You want to read?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, thank you.
I can read it. This comes from online. What is the price of being explicitly political, particularly in the academy? How might subterranean forms of refusal be a space worth occupying while healing and regrouping from explicit political work? A guerrilla goes undercover.
Thank you for that answer. Of that question, I didn't see who asked it. Me? Hugo. Thank you, Hugo. Sorry. Thank you, Hugo. It's funny. I think so. The way I hate to be in spaces that are not. I love being in spaces that are not United States, but I hate being in spaces and assuming that everyone knows how U.S. academia works, and because it's a bizarre world. And there's the tenure system and all that sort of stuff. So a lot of people, so the tenure system, of course, you get a job, and you hopefully, if it's a tenure track job, you have 6 years as an assistant professor, and you're supposed to produce enough and teach well enough and contribute to the university enough well, and then your dossier is sent out among colleagues in your field, and it's sent back, and they evaluate you, and hopefully your colleagues like you in your department, and you get voted on, and then you get tenure. And then tenure just means you're hard to hire elsewhere. But technically it means you're not going to be fired in 6 years, an additional 6 years. So it's this tenure, this junior life as a junior faculty is rife with the feeling, and I want to just say the feeling of precarity. But I think power is lazy and relies on itself, right? The theory of power is just that it's only there when it kind of has to kick in sometimes, and it can kick in capriciously, and the capricious nature of power is precisely what makes it powerful. But otherwise, I would say for anyone who's political in the academy is that you would exploit that and push it to its limitations and not hide. I think the problem is we have a lot of people who are super political and then they get very tame or want to pull things back. And that's also methodologies. And they do that for a number of reasons. Partially it's because of the disciplinary process of getting tenure, right? That you feel vulnerable. And if you push politically in a wrong spot, you won't get renewed and you're out of a job. But also disciplinary, the way you're trained, right? We've recently heard stories from people who do research, and their university comes back and says, you can't do this sort of research because decolonial methodologies is not real science, right? So for me, it's always that's part of the sort of the nascent part of being a guerrilla scholar, is that you always must constantly be, while keeping yourself safe, of course, always be able to not back down, because they're paper dragons half the time. These are paper dragons, right? Also, you don't do it alone. How do guerrilla movements succeed? They succeed, as we know in Cuba, because they have the support of the people. Revolutions don't happen in an atomized way. Capitalism makes us think that we're individuals and atomizes us. And then that is also the seed of our desperation, our depression, our feelings of loneliness, of saying, I'm a revolutionary, I'm a radical, but I'm alone. And how do I do this? How do I invent the revolution by myself? Well, you don't. Revolutionary struggle is a communal struggle. And as scholars, you band together as well and protect each other. And that means as a senior scholar, you protect the junior scholars. And your grad students and your undergraduate students and the laborer and whomever else you have to do. And you do it to the president, to the provost, to the dean, to whomever you have to. So I think subterfuge is good when we need to use it as a weapon, but would not want to rely on it. I think we're powerful. And I think, like in Cuba, when you start off with 27, 28, 80 or whatever revolutionaries, commandos, and that builds when they know the fear of the revolution is coming.
Yeah, you ended where I wanted to start, so I like when that happens, because this comes into your partition question, I think, as well for me, because we're thinking about the ways that psychically we're made to feel like we're not powerful. But if we think about the conditions of how power works, if we weren't able to get the results that we wanted, why would there be so much resources poured into silencing, censoring, making sure that these sorts of things aren't heard? And that's not just in our minds, right? That is true. A system's job is to recalibrate, and to recalibrate means to suppress any dissent that comes in that. But that is part of reality testing. It's for us to keep clear, crystal clear, as revolutionaries, as political beings, about what the source of that anxiety for the system is, and to hit at the heart of that source, right? There's a word in psychology or a defense that's talked about that is called splitting. This is where partition, when you said partition, I was thinking of that. And oftentimes the defense splitting is thought to be a very, quote unquote, primitive, that's the actual word, defense that's used. And what's interesting is that when people split, it's when they choose a side. And so politically, I think we can think about splitting as forfeiting its pathology when we're talking about political struggle. right? And to remain clear and not be seduced into the pathologizing of our positions. There are some positions that must be militant positions. And this is where also partition is that like the job of capitalism, just like the job of settler colonialism, just like the job of any disciplining field, is to dissociate, right, and dismember. And so our antidote to that is reassociating and remembering, both in terms of remembering, but remembering like linking up, right? What I do with this is part of a sort of a revolutionary politics that we commit to. Both of us do this, but for example, I have students who are Palestinian or Arab across the United States that aren't part of my program, and they will contact me and I mentor them around these things. And so it's to also make people not feel alone. They don't have to be within our circles. It's a political commitment to say, we cannot rely, part of the way that power works, especially in the United States, is people need to write you recommendations to get into the next place or to get your job, or you need people to publish. Part of what's happening in the United States is the sort of white hegemonic power, let's say elite class of academics is imploding a little bit, because what has happened over the course of, let's say, the last 20, 30 years is those of us who don't identify as hegemonic sort of standard have built what we call a jabha. We build a front. Thank you for translating. A front, right? And we rely on each other. We're able to divest from power because we don't rely on people in power to write our recommendations for us or help us publish or get referrals. But that is a long-term, that's the long-term, short-term thing. We're investing in a long-term struggle built in locked arms with our ancestors and the folks who did that before us. And we have a politics of giving back, right? Of a politics of care, which is our good friend and comrade Gail Lewis talks about Black feminism as a politics of care. That's what guides us as well.
All right, shall we take one more question online, but let's first see if there's anyone who's with us here. Any takers? You're deferring to the technological. Mark, are you just greeting someone? Here's a question.
Presentation. Thank you. Brilliant presentations. My only complaint is they were both too short. I'm just curious how you envision reparations playing out or taking place. That's a very big deal in this country: economic freedom, land distribution, the materiality of it. How does that take place? And just a comment on what you are saying in terms of revolution, just to point out that sometimes we need to reinforce in each other that it's okay for revolutionaries to get tired. And, you know, there are generativity issues, and as you age and you start to take care of yourself, your family, and other things, sometimes you just don't have the emotional space. And I think people feel guilty about that. But I am curious about your experience with reparations and how you see that playing out.
Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah, no, my name is Pumelelane Mshumi. I'm a student here in this university. But I think I wanted to start somewhere, insofar as being in and of the revolution. Like in South Africa, we agitate and align the masses through a chant. You know? So I wanted just to reintroduce that particular revolutionary spirit, even in this space, because we are discussing revolution here. So amandla, awethu, amandla, awethu. But you must also be in line with what the revolution They're exhausted. Yeah, I think ma'am was describing that. Yeah, no, thanks. No, I won't be extremely long, but you know, I'm one who likes at least in every space to swim against the current. So even in this space, if you'll allow me, even if I swim downwards, allow me just to swim against the current. So swim away. Swim away. So I was saying, you know, that you know, in as far as grappling better with this, you know, the limited insurgent, you know, this restriction in action, you know, is extremely problematic for me, you know, because I think it takes away from what the revolution is, you know, which Cabral always emphasizes, that it's the material condition that we're engaged in. So I'll make something quite practical. You know, I think it was a phenomenon when Fees Must Fall unraveled that so many scholars participated in that mass action. It was a milestone, if you can put it that way. It was not expected. You know, these people, referring to scholars, of course, I'm not one yet. You know, they write and then they indoctrinate in so far as the arguments are concerned, but they don't speak into the actions. You know, and I disagree with the point that, you know, a revolution in as far as scholarly, you know, concern is, it can be trapped in the campus. I disagree with that notion, because even with what I'm saying in so far as the reference to Fees Must Fall, is that the societal expression, you know, was only so far as, or rather, let me put it this way. The society in so far as it being in disarray was captured through Fees Must Fall. But the origin of the, or rather the expression of the true antagonism is found far more emphatically, you know, in society, as opposed to what scholars would like to believe that is found here in the university space. So I think even with this diagnosis, I think that we must begin to say that scholars mustn't not want to be activists, if that makes sense. Being a guerrilla, I disagree with you, good sir, that I'm not a good servant. You know, around the argument of causality, insofar as that you know, we get trapped in so far as, you know, like the blood, as it were, of the revolution, you know, is not a benefit, if that makes sense. It is a bloody arrangement. And we can't run away from that. An activist at some point will have to die on the street. It happens. It's what that's the cause. So I don't want us scholars, you know, to want to be, you know, detached from what the reality is. You know, when you disrupt, for example, a meeting, for will agree with me. When you disrupt a meeting that discusses capitalist perspective, for example, that one would say that Ellen Gray, for an example, wants to fund a project which is solely going to benefit white people. This is a very loose example. The scholar must be ready to sacrifice their bread. I disagree with this notion that they must be scared because they have family. Who doesn't have a family? We're engaged in the revolution. You must never be cowards and so far as dealing with that material condition. So I wanted to contribute at that particular level, but I also wanted, just as I said, to put Mr. Bauer at ease that indeed the revolution is alive in UWC. You want to read it? Thank you. You didn't swim upstream, by the way.
One more question, and then we'll take it. Should we read this?
You want to just
Sure, one last question and then we can answer. Okay, so there's a question online. How did they choose as guerrilla scholars to root themselves in the field of psychology? And what has been the specific challenges and benefits of doing so?
Right. So these are all excellent questions, and I'm just going to start with the comrade over here, which I agree with you. I agree with you 100%, which is why I said, you know, that to start is to understand, well, is to honor the true sacrifices of what our elders and our ancestors and our siblings who have died and who have struggled and who have not died, thankfully, and who are still around, like Layla Khalid or the imprisoned George Abdullah. So I agree with you, you know, and to never, ever, ever, ever think that even someone like Edward Said or some sort of the most famous sort of pro-Palestine scholar could ever really be put on the same level of precarity, level of danger as someone who is picking up a gun and engaged in armed struggle. Okay, I'm hoping by using this language to draw on the power of that sacrifice without diminishing it or extracting from it. To the contrary. When I said earlier about, I think we need to be bold and need to never hide our politics to some degree and to push these spaces that we're in. And I speak as a scholar because that's what I am. If I'm not a psychologist, then I do that within the university. When that comes time to the university saying, retract that or get fired, I'm confident in myself that I will make that right decision. That is the point of the being a guerrilla scholar. It's us. Okay, I don't like to throw shade too much in new environments, but I will. You know, there are too many people who you read and you're like, wow, this shit is so good, right? Wow, look at this scholarship. Whoa, so rad, right? And then you go out and you meet them and they're liberals. So many. Like, don't use Fanon if you're a liberal. Stop it, right? Right? And so, like, I hate that. And so I do think we have to live our principles. I'm in a privileged position to some degree where I don't have to do that to the level of bodily harm usually. I have what I'm not going to, you know, render my bona fides, but we have done that, you know. And I think that's important. I think that's essential. I think putting our bodies on the line sometimes to protect those who are more vulnerable, right? To eat tear gas when we should be doing that and not students. I think that's essential. So I absolutely 100% agree with you. So yeah, right on.
In alignment with that, I think, you know, I'm always struck by, especially liberals, and I'm talking specifically in the United States, but I see this type of conversation elsewhere too, is that it's really telling for us when spaces are more likely to make room for fascists than they are militants, right? There's always a trying to recuperate fascists in some way, reach out to them, talk to them, all this sort of dialogue, reach them. But when a militant is in the space, it closes down very quickly, right? But that's so that it goes back to this question of what is the price? The price is high, but it's not higher than losing everybody's freedom, right? And so, yeah, I mean, we've lost jobs. You take a stance on Palestine, you lose a job. That's never going to make me not take a stance on Palestine, right? Likewise with other cases. So I appreciate you running countercurrent and reminding people that while the university is a part of that and has a very important history of being part of these struggles, that because of neoliberalism, because of the way that corporatization works, because of diversity efforts, that, and this might get into the difference of our liberation struggles currently, that maybe it can't be the site of liberation. Just like psychoanalysis, I don't believe psychoanalysis is the site of liberation. It's one of many tools we can use, right? But it is the street that we're really looking at, right? And what can we lend to that, and what can we sort of support in any way? I want to loop that back around to the reparations question. And I think when we think about these words are very, for lack of a better word, sexy in most contexts, right? When Columbia University does a conference on decolonization, we are not talking about the same type of decolonization, right? When Columbia University sits on stolen Lenape land, right? So that's the sort of, it's to reclaim these defanged and domesticated ideas, including what we mean by reparations, including what we mean by decolonization. So anytime I make a land acknowledgement in the United States and I talk about, number one, whose stolen land I live on and work on, that is a reclaiming of a disavowal too, because otherwise we're walking around just thinking it's Williamsburg, Virginia, when it actually belongs to the Pamunkey people, right? And so that's number one. But I also make a point to point out that when I say decolonization, I mean land back. That is what decolonization means. And so part of it, and there's no two ways around it. We can't just be like, I'm decolonization light, you know, like halfway there. If we are reading Fanon correctly, if we're reading decolonial struggles, we are saying land back efforts are a part of that. We must give land back. We must redistribute that. And that decision needs to be the sovereignty of indigenous peoples the world over, about what does that look like? How does it look? There are many models in the United States, for example. There are some places where indigenous tribes have set up a voluntary tax that residents can pay that gets redistributed to indigenous tribes, and then they buy the land back through, you know, money that was given by the people who are benefiting from that land. But when I say it's up to indigenous people, I mean that. And that means by any means necessary, indigenous fights for reparations is necessary. And I think for us to speak that and to say it's not to task folks with knowing. Everybody will ask the question, well, how will that look? Well, that's not the job to task people with what that means is we need to make space for militants to make those decisions and see how that emerges and not get in their way, which is really what we end up doing, right? Other ways that this is being done in the United States, particularly for descendants of enslaved folks, African folks, has been to have scholarships to schools. There's a lot of ways that this is being done. That doesn't go far enough, in my opinion. And many times those decisions are made without any Black or African-American people being present. So that's saviorship. That's you cleansing your guilt and saying, let me just throw money at this without recognizing what imperial power continues to do, right? So I'll often, white folks will ask me, well, what do I do? And I say, you be a race trader every day. You have to be a race trader every single day if you take reparations seriously. And we have to be settler, right? Traders every single day if we take indigenous land reparations seriously too.
You know, yeah, I'm just, you know, I think it's funny because like reparation and self-care, the two questions you kind of asked seem to be related in a particular way, right? When you think about reparations as repair, right? So I first thing I want to say is I think what's different now in the revolutionary spirit that is circulating globally is that there is an understanding that revolutionary struggle involves communities of care, right? If we're siblings with one another, if we're chosen siblings in our struggles, right, we also care for one another. And that also means that we have to be able to allow everyone to take care of themselves in particular ways, in the ways that they need, right? So I think it's like, to me, that revolutionary idea, which I think was lacking from the revolutionary praxis of my youth, which is kind of like, shut up and suck it up. There are people struggling. There are people, you know, people hurting. You think you're hurting worse than the people who we're fighting for? Shut up and suck it up, right? There is no get tired, right? Don't get tired. And I think what's revolutionary, what's something I've learned from my comrades and siblings now is that community means we take care of one another. And I think that the idea of reparation, that also lies at the center of reparation. Reparation doesn't necessarily mean 40 acres and a mule. That's over now, right? It doesn't mean enfranchise Black folk to be Black capitalists. I hope that reparation means that we as siblings can come in and support ways we can imagine a structural change that is repair, right? And that's what we want to do. We partner with our siblings to help imagine, to support, even when it's not our space to name what reparation looks like, we're there to help and elevate and amplify that support in which we can radically imagine things that are not imaginable, right? Because when you live in the United States, and Lara's talking about land back there, okay, yeah, okay, this is like stolen land. We all know that with this stolen land, but like, what am I gonna do? Let's just give it, you know, give my house back. Yeah, you stole it. So like, it's not imaginable to them, right? And that's what we do as a revolutionary community, to start help imagining, allowing me to imagine now what the revolutionary looks like. It's not just shut up, suck it up, you know, all that, like, for, you know, because all of my, like, my people, a lot of my age think like the younger siblings as like, you know, fragile. Oh, they're so fragile. No, it's not fragile. We're the assholes. We're the assholes now, right? You know what I'm saying? It's because like we see all the you know, the young folk, the young siblings, they know how to take care of one another, right? So I think that is like the bedrock of the revolutionary struggle. And it speaks to, again, that, you know, Hugo's question about, you know, being alone and being, you know, whether you have to be in subterfuge or not. Yeah.
And I'm going to tie in this other question to this about how do we not empty out, right? Decolonization. How do we make it not empty? And I think part of that is precisely this, is to not reality bend about what we mean by decolonization. And I think they can imagine that. That's why they're scared. They can imagine, what do we do? Give our houses back? Yeah, because you have centuries of hoarded wealth and inequity that is built on that. Or people will say, well, I didn't have anything to do with this, so why should I be the one to give it? Well, because of the inequities that have built upon this, that you continue to benefit from. So there's a certain truth telling that needs to be told. And I think there are ways in which sometimes to become palatable to people, to communicate, to reach people, we water down our political convictions, our political statements, but people already get it. That's why they're scared. So I think, you know, holding the militant line is really important because it's not just abstract. It's real. People died for it, right? People continue to die for it. People have been displaced forever. So is that the watering down to reach somebody? That is a liberal notion that presumes somebody is reachable, right? So I'm going to bank on the presumption that somebody is reachable rather than align with the person who has been displaced. And we need to be honest about that, about what we are doing when we make these calculations, when we make these, let's say, when we leverage that to try and be heard, that liberal turn, it has a real material impact on people because they're the ones who are always not, you know, listened to. Some of the challenges, to go back to the question online, what are some of the challenges of that? Psychology is very conservative, very conservative field. So the challenges of that are that people say you don't know your theory. People say it's a political agenda. People say this is not psychology. I say this is not, you're right. This is not my psychology. The psychology you're talking about, not my psychology. Is this a political agenda? Yes, it is. But so is yours, right? And that's the truth telling of it, because people position themselves as though it's neutral. There's no such thing as neutrality. That's a myth. That's a myth that's perpetuated by settler colonialism and capitalism and all that, to say as if there is a pure standard from which we go. So I'm not afraid to say, yes, of course it's a political agenda. It happens to be on the right side of history. Yours isn't.
Yeah, that's the question of decoloniality is a good one because, you know, we tend to, you know, Tuck and Yang article of, you know, decoloniality is not, or decolonization is not a metaphor. And this speaks to some degree between to the comrades' question over here or comment about, you know, there is a difference between an activist and a militant. I have a dear friend, I've learned that from my dear friend Fawaz Trabulsi, who was a militant, a communist militant for many, many years. To think about decoloniality is also to think about context, right? I mean, the problem is that people want one solution fix for everything because they're lazy and they're probably white and they're probably capitalists. And that's what it's just easy, right? Because that's the world that they lived in, of privilege, where you could do that. You know, you go and you buy a cleaning product that also you can put on your, spaghetti. That's what they want, right? But that's not what decoloniality is. It's all about contexts. So to go back to Primesh's question about partition, right? The question about partition, the word partition might mean something in a particular context. And it might mean something, here in Africa and in Southern Africa, right? And then it might mean something in Palestine, very, very particular, right? And for us, it does, for me, for example, yes, partition means 1948, but it also means Sykes-Picot. It also means about, not only the Balfour Declaration, Sykes-Picot, it's the dismembering of the Arab world, right? So if we go back, oh, we don't want partition from 1948, we want a country called Palestine. Some of us didn't. Some of the folks were working in the Arab world at that time to erase those borders even then, to work against a previous partition of colonialism, of Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, right? So decoloniality means certain things, and that's quite different than what's decolonization in Turtle Island, what is now known as United States, right? So I just want to really always drive home this idea of context. Decoloniality is important, but it's always rooted. It's always rooted in the material.
There are two other questions online. Do you want me to read? Do we have time?
We'll take those two,
Okay.
and then we'll have to go some of it to a close.
Okay, so one is, how do you elevate the patriotic revolutionary agenda from materialistic mental corruption to the real liberal principles through the rehabilitation process? And the second question is, how do scholars support the broader real struggle outside our hallowed halls without ourselves colonizing those struggles? What is the role of the student scholar in the struggle? Yes.
What was that last one?
What's the role of the student scholar in the struggle, and how do you support the struggle without colonizing?
Yeah, that's a big question. Those are good ones. Those are big ones.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
There we go. So, just want to thank you for really, thank you for a really fantastic presentation from both of you. And you've raised a number of terms that such as anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-racist. And if, it's almost as if you transpose to the 70s, 60s. And so it brings up the whole idea of how hegemony in the Gramscian sense has, so we say, domination of capitalist hegemony. And of course, it's linked, all linked to questions of ideas, right? And so I'm sort of curious about how guerrilla scholarship can play a role to challenge the normalization of exploitation, of capitalism, and how we can, in a sense, challenge how hegemonic ideas have become common sense, normalized. And so what role is there for the guerrilla scholar? Not just in the academy, but also in the community, sort of going back to Gramsci about how do we move from the intellectual, narrowly understood, to the organic intellectual. And so, and then the final question is, in the US, because in the US academy, probably if you're in a Ivy League university, it's easy, relatively easy, even with tenure. But if you go into the public universities, it's much more difficult to have more radical scholarship, especially in the age of Trump. And I also think about Brazil, where Bolsonaro fortunately got elected out of power. There was this whole rightward shift where they even promoted the whole idea, escola sem partido, so a school without a party, essentially that the idea of promoting conservative ideas. So anybody who raised issues around racism or gender equality was seen as being radical, and were being called out. And so there's been this shift, because that wasn't the case, always the case in Brazil or in many parts of the world. And so I guess I want to come back to this question about how do we shift and not just speak in a space, or how do we normalize terms like anti-imperialism and the practice of anti-imperialism and anti-capitalism in the 21st century? Thank you.
All right, that's a good set of questions.
That's an excellent set of questions. Excellent.
One question.
That was good. That was excellent. No.
I wanted to, and I, yeah, exactly. No, so you know, you raised the issue and the quotation by Angela Davis around diversity, and we can broaden it a little bit to speak about identity politics. And you know, since like Angela Davis says, capitalism likes diversity, and like you mentioned, they also like identity politics. And how, and clearly identity, I'm not trying to dismiss identity politics, it's important. How do we ensure that we address identity politics without fragmenting ourselves, without losing sight of the principal struggle, which is in a sense anti-capitalist? As my friend Mark will say, everything's about the accumulation of capital. So, so yeah, so sorry, if you can just speak to it and, you know, just create a conversation on it, because I think that's for me the fundamental issue. Thank you.
So without calling it power, I will exercise something called power. You have the last word.
Great.
So lead us to the end of the session.
I'll
Take up some conversation beyond.
I'll give you the last word because you're much more skilled than I am. And you want to end on her voice, not mine. These three questions, the two online and your question, actually seemed to kind of speak to one another. To the sibling on the you know, in the questions online, I don't want to tell students how they can organize or should organize, because again, I feel that I am learning to, as Lara says, Gail says, I'm learning to walk alongside of that student organizing. I'm here to lend always, you know, advice of kind of what not to do from experience, but I'm also always learning. And I think that all I will have to say, and this is also to speak to the other sibling about the revolutionary, the patriotic cause, is also we should learn from, as much as we love and respect our elders, we learn from them negatively as well as positively, which is also always think about sectarianism, right? Is always think about, we certainly share our desire for the transformation of society towards a better thing and a better place for everyone, more than we might disagree among one another, right? So as an anarcho-Marxist myself, I've always been bewildered by, you know, Trotskyites and Marxist-Leninists and anarchists wanting to, you know, beat the crap out of one another, because we're not there yet, you know. So that's part of the conversation.
You meant that, right?
Hell yeah. Hell yeah. I meant that, completely meant that. Yeah. And it's this is the question, and a great question is the first thing is how do we actualize, this is kind of what I was asking in the paper, is like, how do we actualize what we teach and what we've learned and what we've seen and those lives of people who are so much greater than us in many ways that we think about, right? How do we actualize their power? How do we actualize the moments of liberation in which they were living, right? Those people living in armed struggle were not slaves anymore, right? They were not oppressed anymore. And I'm not glorifying or romanticizing the armed struggle. It was hard and took sacrifices and was painful, right? But they did it because they knew in the moment that you grab the gun, like Fanon says, you're no longer oppressed. You're now free. How do we teach that in the class? Just to say that in the class, my students' heads explode, right? To tell them about violence, you know, as a revolutionary tool, as sometimes a revolutionary essential, their head explodes. But that's where we start. We have to start denormalizing the way we have been decommissioned as militants, as intellectuals have been decommissioned as militants, right? We have to normalize the language. And we can see the language has been, with the great gains we have made. I mean, think about how pronouns are used now in short term. The word Palestine, I've been saying Palestine forever. People have got really pissed off in the past. Now they don't get as pissed off, which kind of pisses me off a little bit because I like pissing people off. But Palestine, people go around and say Palestine. So this is to speak it, to speak your presence, to speak our presence, to make sure that everyone knows that the world that we are fighting for and our analysis is not just, oh, that's your opinion. No, it's not my opinion, punk. This is reality, right? Our analysis is reality of material conditions. That's what Cabral teaches us, right? It is the material conditions, right? That's what we do. We denormalize what capitalism mystifies. Capitalism mystifies this stuff, right? And our job is to demystify and regularize and use the language over and over and over and over again. Palestine, Palestine, Palestine. They, whatever we need to do, right? So I think that's it. But on the other hand, too, and that is an act. To speak is an act. But it also does go into action. It goes into not buying shit. Stop buying shit. Join the BDS. There's something called the BDS. When you're really hardcore on the BDS, there's not much stuff you can buy because Nestle owns everything, right? Johnson & Johnson owns everything, right? Unilever, everything. So yeah, it's small, but it's something. And it's that small bit that starts to denaturalize what consumption looks like and the stuff that you really need. Right? And the planting garden might be an issue. You can do that. So like action does matter. Action does. And then of course, I do think as intellectuals and scholars, I do think we need to be in demonstrations. I do think we need to be on the ground. And I do think we need organizing them. We need to be giving them our classrooms. Folks need classrooms. Folks need space. You need space. I got a space. And I'm just signing up for a classroom. Oh, what's it for? It's for, you know, exactly. Basket weaving club, you got a space now. That's what we do. It's actions. It's action. Revolutionary. To speak revolutionary language analysis is to enact it, but also it does. We have to support through our own embodiment, through our own actions, also at every possible turn as well.
I don't think there's anything I need to add.
No,
to
you can.
Well, I had said also speak the word, right? Speak them over and over and over again. And I suppose what I would say is if we think psychically and if we think structurally, then don't be surprised when they get co-opted. That is not a failure. That is it working correctly. Because when co-optation happens, we know we've hit a nerve. When decolonization gets co-opted, we say, okay, we need to then double down on the precision of what this actually means. And then it'll get co-opted again, and then it'll get co-opted again. And that's the parallel to thinking about our revolutionary struggles. I am not a pessimist revolutionary thinker or leftist. I don't look at our struggles as failures. The things that didn't work are not failures. They're moments of, right, just like there are upheavals. And in the in-between, maybe this is the subterfuge place. We are waiting for the next moment to seize power again, right? And I think that there's, while working for it constantly, we're constantly imagining the world we want to live in. And what that means also is in relationships, in our own relationships. If we're disrupting patriarchy, we have to disrupt coercion and domination everywhere. That starts in our relationships. How do we imagine an abolitionist world without our relational textures being a part of that? Right? So it's always moving, commuting between the structural and the individual, which is back to this question about identity politics. And, you know, I can't talk about identity politics without talking about the Combahee River Collective. There's what they actually meant by identity politics and returning to that every time. It is, and of course, intersectionality, not as an analysis of identity where the Germans lift out, there are 17 identities you can, no, it is an analysis of oppression and crevices of vulnerability that are created by structures. So while we can say specificity is important, it is important if one is from South Africa or one is from Palestine. That specificity is important, but also to remember that structures enshrine that identity. And that is the walking alongside our students. So it's never shutting down my students who start with identity politics. We have to start somewhere. There's an affective fire there in that identity. There's something they're connecting to. There's something that's important to them, right? That's when we walk alongside them and say, what do we do to extend this to its revolutionary end? So that we don't get locked down in hoarding. Because an identity politics that is just mine is hoarding. How can we then elevate it to a structural analysis that redistributes wealth and redistributes our responsibility for taking that into our hands too?
Thank you very, very much for that fiery and blistering set of concluding comments. You know, someone speaking of ancestors once said, you know, to be militant is not to be sad. And, you know, there's something about, you know, what one holds on to in the passions of politics that it would be worth thinking about. I think there is something about the question of how one names the present that is going to be very telling. In South Africa, so I'm not entirely convinced by, you know, I'm hoping that we can have different perspectives on the questions you've raised. I might not have been the right person that Umesh asked to mediate this because my questions were leading somewhere else. I do think the question of technology now is a pertinent one. It's certainly one that fascism is mobilizing all over the place. And in this country, we know its instrumentalities in very, very definite and telling ways. So given that I'm just a minor voice in this conversation, I want to thank both of you for your incredible insights and you know, provocations. And I want to thank everyone for contributing to this conversation. Hopefully we can pick up some of this conversation beyond this concluding moment. Okay.
Yeah. So Lara and Stephen, thank you so much for making time to share your insights with us and for coming to UWC. And we hope that you'll be coming to us again next year when more students are on campus. And most importantly for, I think, bringing up ideas of anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, anti-racism back onto, and I think the challenge for all of us is how do we not just raise it, but make it an hegemonic force that is rooted in actual struggles. Because it's only through that we can actually challenge the hegemony or capitalist hegemony, you know, and maybe then in that way chart a new path of egalitarianism and just a respect for each other. I mean, with the recent elections in Brazil, the attacks on Afro-Brazilians and on gay people, it was just phenomenal. And what it raises is the rootedness of these conservative ideas. And so what you've discussed and raised today is so important for us, not just here, but throughout the world, about, like you said, these small struggles. And the challenge is, how do we coalesce and how do we bring together what David Harvey calls these militant particularisms into this, not just the militant one, but into universal struggles that doesn't sort of ignore difference, but rather brings it together to a common end. Like you said, how do we bring together these different forms of oppression and different identities so that we come together and towards one common goal? So again, on that note, I want to thank you, and I want to thank all of you online, as well as all of you who are here present. But most importantly, I want to thank the tech people, Shanaz, Umesh, and everybody else for their fantastic work. And as Stephen said, it is, or is it Lara who said, the people who do the invisible work. So thank you. And the struggle is about people who actually do the invisible work. And so maybe that's what we need to do. The Guerilla Scholarship will be invisible as well as upfront. Okay, on that note, thank you.
Very good question.
Thank you. We will know. I just want to do two things. That I will have the permission. One is to ask Primesh if you can give this to our colleagues.
Burn it and not me.
No.
That's a gift from UWC. It's becoming UWC.
Wow. I think it's written by someone we know.
Well, it's written by several people, but I mean, the mark of it is Ingrid Masondo's photographs, which we use to kind of get people to reflect on the difficult histories of this institution and what it means to think one's way out of apartheid.
Wow, amazing. And then I would like to have that.
Thank you so much.
Wow.
Oh my God.
Oh,
Oh, wow.
wow.
Thank you.
Thank you so
much to all of you.
Finally, just to all the colleagues here, thank you very much for your being here. You'll have some time to connect with with people on the Zoom. There's the recording will be available, and I imagine the final word it would be something that Frederick Douglass said, that if there is no struggle, there is no. I'll find the quote. Oh, if there's no struggle, there's no progress. Those who favor freedom but deprecate agitation are people who do not are people who want who do not want to plow the soil or are afraid of the angry waters when they want the ocean. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. And so you've just helped us to be able to say, let's try and reclaim the spaces that we need. And that's for everyone here, including Shumi. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we'll see.